Would you stand up for a stranger being mocked? One young man did, and his actions left a lasting impact on everyone. The Greenfield Café, a modest roadside diner in Indiana, was the kind of place where time seemed to move a little slower. Its walls were adorned with vintage photographs, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint aroma of sizzling bacon. The café was a gathering spot for locals, a comforting space where familiar faces came to share meals and stories. At one of the corner tables near the large window sat Arthur, a retired Marine. His presence was quiet yet dignified, marked by the military cap resting on the table beside him. The cap wasn't just an accessory, it was a testament to decades of service, adorned with medals that gleamed faintly under the warm light. Arthur was a regular at the café, often choosing the same table by the window where he could watch the world go by as he enjoyed his breakfast. That morning, Arthur had ordered his usual, pancakes with a side of crispy bacon and a cup of black coffee. His movements were deliberate, his hands steady despite the subtle tremor that had become more pronounced over the years. His eyes, pale and weathered, carried the weight of memories that only someone who had lived through the unimaginable could understand. The other patrons rarely bothered him, respecting his solitude. The café hummed with subdued chatter and the occasional clatter of dishes. A couple sat in the booth across from Arthur, their conversation quiet but filled with laughter. A waitress in a well-worn apron moved between tables, her cheerful demeanor adding to the welcoming atmosphere. It was a typical weekday morning, and everything seemed comfortably predictable. Then, the door swung open. The bell above the entrance jangled, announcing the arrival of a group of young men. Their laughter was loud and boisterous, shattering the peaceful ambiance of the café. They strode in with an air of casual confidence, their sneakers squeaking against the tiled floor. Dressed in hoodies and jeans, they looked like they had just come from a basketball court or a late-night hangout. Arthur glanced up briefly, his gaze flickering toward the group before returning to his plate. He didn't want any trouble, and for a moment it seemed as though they wouldn't notice him. But as the group scanned the room for a place to sit, their eyes landed on the older man near the window. "Check it out," one of them muttered, nudging his friend. His voice wasn't particularly loud, but it carried across the room, breaking the bubble of calm that had enveloped the café. The tallest of the group, wearing a backward cap, smirked as his eyes landed on Arthur's cap. The group made their way to the table closest to Arthur's, their voices deliberately loud as they pulled out chairs. The tall one leaned back in his seat, his chair creaking under the weight, and glanced over at Arthur. "Hey, Pops," he called out, his tone playful but edged with mockery. "Nice hat. You win that at a raffle or something?" Arthur froze for a moment, his fork hovering in mid-air. He lowered it slowly, his appetite fading as he felt the weight of their stares. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup, the warmth of the ceramic grounding him against the growing unease. He didn't respond, hoping they would lose interest and turn their attention elsewhere. But the group wasn't done. The tall one leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table as he addressed Arthur again. "What's the matter? Don't you speak? Or did you leave your voice back in the war?" A ripple of uncomfortable silence spread through the café. The other patrons exchanged uneasy glances, some shifting in their seats, but no one spoke up. The waitress behind the counter paused mid-step, her tray balanced precariously in one hand, but she didn't intervene. Arthur kept his eyes on his plate, his jaw tightening. He wasn't a confrontational man, not anymore. Years of discipline had taught him to endure, to remain calm in the face of adversity. But the sting of their words was undeniable, each one like a sharp jab that cut deeper than the last. The tall one smirked, emboldened by Arthur's silence. He picked up a ketchup packet from the table and began twisting it between his fingers. "What's with all the medals anyway? Trying to impress someone? Or are you just living in the past?" Arthur swallowed hard, his hand gripping the edge of the table. The medals on his cap weren't for show, they were a part of his story, a testament to battles fought and sacrifices made. But to this group, they were nothing more than shiny trinkets to mock. Around the café, the tension was palpable. The other diners avoided Arthur's gaze, their discomfort evident in their averted eyes and fidgeting hands. It was as if everyone was waiting for someone else to step in, to say something, to do something, but no one did. Arthur's hands trembled as he reached for his coffee again, his fingers brushing against the warm ceramic. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had endured worse in his lifetime, but the weight of this moment was heavier than he expected. The laughter of the young men echoed in his ears, sharp and grating. The air was thick with discomfort, but no one moved. The young men's laughter grew louder, filling the room like an unwelcome storm. And then, from across the café, the scrape of a chair against the floor broke through the noise. The young men's laughter echoed louder now, filling the café with a cruel energy that seemed to press down on everyone present. The tall one with the backward cap leaned even closer to Arthur's table, his smirk growing wider, as if fueled by the veteran's silence. "What's the matter, Grandpa? Cat got your tongue?" he taunted, his voice carrying an edge that sent a ripple of unease through the room. His friends chuckled, their amusement sharp and stinging. One of them, shorter and stockier, leaned back in his chair with a smug grin. "Maybe he doesn't hear so well anymore," he said, his words laced with mockery. "Old age will do that to you." Arthur's fingers curled around the handle of his coffee cup, his knuckles whitening. His face remained stoic, but the faint tremor in his hand betrayed the effort it took to keep his composure. He had faced danger and ridicule before, but this was different. It was public. It was humiliating. And the worst part was that no one was stepping in. The tall one grabbed a straw from the table and twirled it between his fingers, his smirk never faltering. "Come on, Pops," he sneered. "Tell us one of your war stories, like those cheesy ones from the movies. Maybe we'll even thank you for your service." Arthur's jaw tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line. His eyes flickered toward the medals on his cap, each one representing a chapter of his life, moments of valor, sacrifice, and pain. They were badges of honor, symbols of a past he had carried with pride. But to these boys, they were nothing more than shiny trinkets to mock. "Hey, I've got an idea," the shorter one said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He stood up and gave an exaggerated salute, nearly knocking over his chair in the process. "Yes, sir. Reporting for duty." His friends burst into laughter, slapping the table as if they'd just heard the punchline to a hilarious joke. Arthur's gaze remained fixed on his plate, his appetite long gone. The sound of their laughter echoed in his ears, each chuckle like a blow to his dignity. He wanted to say something, to stand up and defend himself, but his voice felt trapped in his throat, weighed down by decades of restraint and the crushing reality of his isolation in this moment. Around the café, the silence from the other patrons was deafening. The waitress behind the counter busied herself with wiping down an already spotless countertop, her hands trembling slightly. A man in a nearby booth glanced at the scene but quickly returned to his phone, pretending not to notice. A young mother with a toddler shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting between Arthur and the group, but she said nothing. The tall one leaned back in his chair, his smirk now a full grin. "You know, Pops," he said, his tone almost conversational, "you should really lighten up. It's all in good fun." Arthur's grip on his coffee cup tightened. The trembling in his hands wasn't just from age anymore. It was frustration, anger, and hurt. He wasn't a man who sought conflict, but the blatant disrespect stung in a way he hadn't felt in years. Still, he remained silent, refusing to give them the reaction they so clearly wanted. One of the young men mimicked the tall one's mock salute, and another threw a crumpled napkin onto Arthur's table, the gesture childish yet deeply disrespectful. The group laughed again, their voices filling the small café like a toxic fog. And then, just when it seemed the harassment would continue unchecked, a sharp, deliberate sound cut through the noise, the scrape of a chair being pushed back across the floor. The sound of the chair scraping across the floor was sharp and deliberate, silencing the group's laughter in an instant. Heads turned toward the source of the noise, and the café seemed to hold its breath. Standing calmly at a corner table was a young man, tall and composed, his blonde hair catching the sunlight streaming through the window. It was Barron Trump. He had been seated quietly with his security detail, enjoying a late breakfast that no one had paid much attention to until now. His navy blazer and crisp white shirt contrasted with the casual atmosphere of the cafe, but it wasn't his attire that drew everyone's attention. It was the quiet authority in his posture and the calm intensity in his eyes. For a moment, the group of young men froze, their confidence faltering as Barron's gaze locked onto them. He didn't rush or make a dramatic gesture. Instead, he walked forward with measured steps, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. Each step seemed to echo in the now silent cafe, the weight of the moment hanging heavily in the air. The tall one with the backward cap shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his bravado flickering like a dying flame. "What's this about?" he said, forcing a smirk. His voice lacked the same confidence it had moments ago. Barron stopped a few feet from their table, his expression steady and composed. He spoke softly, but his words carried a sharpness that cut through the tension. "I'm just wondering," he said, his tone calm but firm, "why you think it's acceptable to treat someone like this?" The tall one chuckled nervously, glancing at his friends for support. "It's just a joke," he said, his smirk returning weakly. "We weren't doing anything wrong." Barron tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "A joke?" he repeated, his voice quiet but carrying an edge. "Does he look like he's laughing?" He gestured toward Arthur, who was staring down at his plate, his shoulders hunched under the weight of the humiliation. The medals on his cap caught the light, their significance glaringly obvious in contrast to the group's mockery. Arthur didn't look up, but his hands stopped trembling, as though Barron's presence alone had steadied him. The cafe remained silent, every patron watching the scene unfold. The waitress, who had been hiding behind the counter, peeked out cautiously. The young mother clutched her toddler a little closer, her eyes wide with curiosity and a hint of shame. Even the man who had been glued to his phone put it down, his attention fully on the confrontation. Barron's voice softened slightly, but his tone remained resolute. "Do you even know who this man is? What he's been through? The sacrifices he's made so that you have the freedom to sit here and say what you want?" The tall one shifted again, his discomfort growing more visible. "Look, we didn't mean anything by it," he muttered, his bravado crumbling. His friends avoided Barron's gaze, their earlier laughter now replaced by uneasy silence. Barron didn't let up. He took another step closer, his hands still in his pockets. "Words matter," he said, his voice carrying a gravity that made even the other patrons feel the weight of the moment. "Your actions matter. And when you disrespect someone who's given so much for this country, it doesn't say anything about them. It says everything about you." The shorter one, who had been the first to mock Arthur, cleared his throat awkwardly. "We were just messing around," he said, his voice barely audible. "We didn't mean to upset anyone." Barron raised an eyebrow. "Messing around? Do you see the impact of your jokes?" He gestured again toward Arthur, whose silence was more powerful than any words could have been. "Think about what you're doing. You don't have to know someone's story to treat them with respect." The other patrons began to sit up straighter, their shame mirrored in their body language. The waitress stepped forward slightly as if ready to intervene should things escalate further. The young mother whispered something to her child, her expression softening as she glanced at Arthur. Barron's gaze swept over the group, lingering on each of them. "You have a choice," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "You can continue this behavior and show everyone here who you really are, or you can do the right thing. It's up to you." For a moment, no one moved. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of Barron's words pressing down on everyone in the room. Even the security detail, who had remained seated but alert, seemed to be watching with approval. And just when it seemed like the group might argue back, the tall one dropped his gaze, the fight draining from him entirely. The tall young man's gaze faltered under the weight of Barron's words. His earlier smirk was gone, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He opened his mouth as if to retort, but the confidence that had fueled his mockery had drained away. Around him, his friends sat in silence, their previous bravado crumbling like a poorly built wall. The air in the café seemed charged, every patron acutely aware of the gravity of the moment. Barron, standing firm and composed, took another step closer. His movements were deliberate, but there was no aggression in them, only calm authority. His hands remained tucked casually in his pockets, his posture relaxed yet commanding. "You called it a joke," he said, his voice low but firm. "But jokes aren't supposed to hurt people. Look at him." He motioned toward Arthur, whose shoulders had begun to lift slightly, as if some of the weight pressing down on him was being eased. Arthur's trembling hands rested on the edge of the table now, his coffee cup untouched. His weathered face, once drawn and pale, showed a glimmer of something new, perhaps hope, perhaps relief. Barron's presence had shifted the dynamic entirely. One of the younger men muttered, "We didn't mean any harm," but his voice was barely audible. Barron turned his gaze toward him, the sharpness in his eyes softening slightly. "If you didn't mean harm," Barron said, his tone measured, "then why keep going? Why mock someone you don't even know?" The question hung in the air unanswered. Barron didn't wait for a reply. He shifted his focus back to the tall one who was now fidgeting with the brim of his cap. "Let me ask you something," Barron said, his tone steady but cutting. "Do you have a grandfather?" The tall one hesitated, glancing at his friends before nodding. "Yeah." "Would you treat him like this?" Barron asked, his voice tinged with quiet challenge. "Would you let someone else do it and stand by, laughing?" The question struck a nerve. The tall one looked down at his hands, his bravado entirely gone. His friends avoided eye contact, their silence speaking volumes. Barron's words were like a mirror, forcing them to confront their actions. The tension in the café was palpable, but Barron didn't waver. He turned his attention back to Arthur, his expression softening further. "Sir," he said, his voice gentle now, "you don't deserve this. You've already given so much. You've earned the right to sit here in peace." Arthur looked up slowly, his eyes glistening. For a moment he said nothing, as if searching for the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough but steady. "Thank you," he said simply, the depth of his gratitude evident in those two words. Barron nodded, then turned back to the group. "It's time to do the right thing," he said firmly. "Apologize. Not because you're being told to, but because you know it's the right thing to do." The tall one glanced at his friends, who shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The shorter one, who had mocked Arthur first, cleared his throat and mumbled, "Sorry." His words were barely audible, but the sincerity in his tone suggested that Barron's words had reached him. The others followed suit, each one offering a quiet apology. When it came to the tall one, he hesitated for a moment before finally meeting Arthur's gaze. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice subdued. There was no sarcasm, no mockery, just genuine regret. Arthur gave a small nod, his lips pressing together as he struggled to hold back tears. The apologies didn't erase the hurt, but they carried a weight of their own, a small step toward restoring the dignity that had been stripped from him moments earlier. Barron didn't linger on their apologies. He stepped back slightly, giving the group space to gather their things. "Now," he said calmly, "you've got somewhere else to be." The tall one nodded, and without another word, the group rose from their seats. They shuffled toward the door, their earlier swagger replaced with an uneasy quiet. The bell above the door jingled as they left, and the sound was almost like a sigh of relief for everyone inside. The patrons, who had been silent throughout the ordeal, began to stir. Some exchanged glances, a few whispered among themselves, but the energy in the café had shifted entirely. The waitress, who had been rooted behind the counter, stepped forward hesitantly, her expression a mix of admiration and guilt. Barron turned back to Arthur and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone," he said softly. "People notice, and people care." Arthur's lips trembled, but this time, it wasn't from fear or humiliation, it was from gratitude. He looked at Barron with a mix of awe and appreciation, his eyes saying what words couldn't. For the first time that morning, the café was silent in a way that felt peaceful rather than oppressive. And as Barron returned to his table, the atmosphere seemed to carry a renewed sense of respect. The cafe was quiet in the wake of the young men's departure, the jingling bell above the door marking the end of a storm that had shaken everyone in the room. The silence lingered for a moment longer before life slowly began to return to the space. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. But the energy had shifted. There was a weight to the air, a collective sense that something important had just taken place. Arthur sat motionless at his table, his hands resting on the edge, his coffee still untouched. The humiliation he had felt only minutes ago had begun to fade, replaced by a strange mix of relief and disbelief. His eyes, watery but determined, stayed fixed on the table in front of him as if processing what had just happened. For so long, he had carried the burden of his sacrifices quietly, enduring the world's indifference. But today, someone had noticed. Someone had cared. Barron Trump, having returned to his seat, observed Arthur with quiet composure. His security detail remained nearby, watching discreetly but without interfering. The young man leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed, but his focus remained on the elderly veteran. It was clear that Barron wasn't just satisfied with silencing the bullies. He wanted to ensure that Arthur felt seen and respected. The waitress, who had been rooted behind the counter for much of the confrontation, finally approached Arthur's table with hesitant steps. She held a fresh pot of coffee in one hand and a plate with a warm slice of apple pie in the other. "Here you go, sir," she said softly, placing the plate and cup in front of him. "It's on the house. Thank you for your service." Arthur looked up at her, his lips parting as if to say something, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he nodded slowly, his expression one of gratitude. The waitress gave him a small smile before retreating, her shoulders a little straighter now, as though inspired by the events that had just unfolded. Across the room, other patrons began to react. The man who had been glued to his phone earlier stood and approached Arthur's table. "Sir," he said, clearing his throat awkwardly, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry I didn't step in sooner. You deserve better." He extended his hand, and after a moment Arthur reached out and shook it firmly. A young mother seated nearby leaned over with her toddler perched on her lap. "My father served in the Navy," she said, her voice tinged with emotion. "Thank you for everything you've done for this country." The toddler, too young to understand the gravity of the moment, waved his tiny hand at Arthur and giggled. Arthur's lips curved into a faint smile, the lines on his face softening as he nodded in acknowledgement. The interaction, though simple, was enough to remind him that respect still existed in the world. Barron, meanwhile, observed all of this from his seat. He exchanged a quiet glance with his security detail, who gave him a small, approving nod. The young man then rose from his chair and walked back to Arthur's table. He stopped just short of the table, giving Arthur the space to acknowledge him. "Sir," Barron said, his voice soft but steady, "you deserve more than apologies and gestures. You deserve gratitude, respect, and peace. What happened today shouldn't have happened, and I hope it never does again." Arthur looked up at Barron, his expression a mix of humility and appreciation. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Stand up for me, I mean." "Yes, I did," Barron replied, his tone unwavering. "Because when we see something wrong, it's our duty to stand up and make it right." Arthur's hands, now steadier than before, reached for his coffee cup. He took a small sip, the warmth spreading through him like a balm. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," he said after a moment. "Your parents must be proud." Barron smiled faintly. "I hope so," he said, his voice lightening just enough to soften the mood. "But they taught me that actions speak louder than words. Today was about showing, not just saying." The cafe's atmosphere continued to shift, the once tense room now filled with a quiet reverence. Other patrons began to approach Arthur, each offering a kind word or gesture of respect. A man near the counter paid for Arthur's meal without saying a word, simply nodding in acknowledgement before leaving. The waitress brought over more coffee for Barron, her earlier hesitance replaced with admiration. Arthur, who had felt so isolated only moments ago, now found himself surrounded by a community that recognized his worth. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel invisible. And as the morning wore on, the Greenfield Café became more than just a place for breakfast. It became a symbol of how one act of courage could ripple through a room, changing not only the course of a moment but the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. As the morning sun rose higher, its light pouring through the cafe windows, the scene inside Greenfield Cafe had transformed. What began as a tense and hostile moment had shifted into something remarkable, a quiet testament to the power of courage, respect, and doing the right thing. The cafe, once filled with mocking laughter, now resonated with warmth and understanding. Arthur, still seated at his corner table, felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The humiliation he had endured was fading, replaced by a renewed sense of dignity. Around him, the gestures of kindness and words of respect from strangers filled the space left by the young men's cruel taunts. His coffee was warm again, and the slice of pie before him sat untouched, not because he didn't want it, but because he was still overwhelmed by the humanity he had witnessed. Barron Trump stood near Arthur's table, a small but steady presence that had reshaped the room's energy. His quiet confidence had disarmed the bullies and inspired the cafe's patrons to act with compassion. It was clear he didn't seek recognition or praise. His actions had come from a place of principle, not performance. Barron reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out a small, embossed card. "Sir," he said, his voice gentle but resolute, "if you ever need anything, support, a listening ear, anything at all, don't hesitate to reach out." He placed the card on the table next to Arthur's hand, the simple gesture carrying a depth of sincerity. Arthur looked at the card, his fingers brushing its edge as if testing whether this moment was real. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "Not just for this, but for reminding me that there's still good in the world." Barron smiled faintly, his expression warm. "It's people like you who give us that good," he replied. "You've done your part. The rest of us just have to do ours." As Barron turned to leave, his security detail quietly rose to follow him. The patrons in the cafe watched him go, some with subtle nods of acknowledgement, others with quiet admiration. The bell above the door jingled as Barron exited, the sound a gentle punctuation mark to the morning's events. But the story wasn't over. The man who had paid for Arthur's meal approached him again, this time with an outstretched hand. "Sir, I'd be honored to shake your hand," he said. Arthur stood, his back straighter now, and shook the man's hand firmly. Around them, other patrons began to approach, offering their gratitude and respect. What had started as a solitary meal now felt like a gathering of community. The young mother, still holding her toddler, approached as well. "Thank you for your service," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. The toddler waved again, his innocent gesture bringing a rare, genuine smile to Arthur's face. The waitress, emboldened by the morning's events, returned to Arthur's table with a fresh cup of coffee and a heartfelt smile. "You're welcome here any time," she said, her tone carrying a weight that left no room for doubt. Arthur sat back down, his hands steady as he lifted the new cup of coffee. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly seen, not as a relic of the past or a symbol, but as a person whose life and experiences mattered. Outside, Barron walked toward a black SUV parked discreetly near the curb. Before getting in, he paused and glanced back at the cafe. He could see through the window. Arthur, now surrounded by kind faces, smiling faintly as he engaged with the other patrons. Barron's expression softened, and he gave a small nod to himself before climbing into the vehicle. Inside the cafe, the hum of life had returned, but it was different now. The patrons weren't just eating breakfast or scrolling through their phones. They were engaged with one another, sharing conversations and meaningful glances. The impact of the morning's events lingered like a warm glow, reminding everyone of the power of small but significant actions. Arthur picked up the card Barron had left behind, turning it over in his hands. The embossed letters and sleek design hinted at wealth and status, but it was the message behind the gesture that struck him most. It wasn't about the card. It was about the fact that someone cared enough to leave it. As he slipped the card into his pocket, Arthur looked around the cafe, taking in the faces of the people who had once been silent. Now they weren't just witnesses. They were participants in a shared moment of humanity. And that, Arthur realized, was worth far more than an apology. This story reminds us all of an important truth. Respect and kindness are powerful tools that can change the course of someone's day, or even their life. When we see something wrong, we have a choice: to stay silent or to step in and make a difference. Let this story inspire you to choose the latter. If you found this story moving, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the impact one person can have. Because sometimes, all it takes is one small act of courage to bring out the best in everyone.